Hello and welcome. Alright, by now you know how this is going to work. You can skip to this timestamp if you don't want the episode ruined. I'm going to start with a overall general this is what happened in this show with complete spoilers section. Then we're going to talk about the bad, my nitpicky things, my neutral things, and all the good things I found about this episode. Alright, you ready? Again, this timestamp if you don't want spoilers. Let's talk about episode 4 of The Mandalorian called Sanctuary. The episode starts with us looking at the daily life of some brine shrimp in a small village. The peace and tranquility of the village is suddenly disrupted as blaster fire rains down on the villagers. We get what looks like to be a Gamorrean raiding party streaming out from the forest, taking all the food, and then piecing out. We cut to Avery and Theo, who are arguing over the thermostat controls in the station wagon. Avery is flying for the planet of Surgeon to lay low for a couple months with Theo, but wouldn't you know it, they just happen to land near the village that was raided earlier in the episode. Avery goes out to scout, instructing Theo to stay in the ship and not move, which of course leads to the hilarious moment where the docking ramp lowers down and there's Theo standing next to Avery. Avery and Theo walk into the bar where Mrs. Aragorn is sitting in the corner waiting for a Mrs. Underhill. For some reason, Avery is super interested in getting Mrs. Aragorn's digits, but while he's interrogating the lady working the bar, Mrs. Aragorn pulls a Houdini and Avery leaves Theo in her capable hands. Avery goes into predator mode and starts tracking the heat signatures off of Mrs. Aragorn's footsteps. But she puts the smack down on him for not taking no for an answer. Fortunately, no one can fight in the presence of the most adorable Theo's judgmental gaze, and Mrs. Aragorn accepts Avery's invitation to dinner. Mrs. Aragorn gives an info dump the size of the Death Star about what she's been doing since the fall of the Death Star over Endor, explaining that she knew Avery was part of the guild and thought he had a tracking fob on her, which is why she beat him up. After dinner, Mrs. Aragorn gives a "this planet isn't big enough for the both of us" ultimatum, and Avery decides to leave the entire planet as a result. While getting ready to leave the planet, Gisaku and Mosoko show up asking Avery for help.
Dad, no one's going to get that reference.
Well, I've never seen The Magnificent Seven, so people are just going to have to live with my reference to the original source. Avery initially turns them down. However, when he hears them talking about how far away they live in the middle of nowhere, he decides to go with them, but not before taking the payment they offered and hiring Mrs. Aragorn. The next morning, Avery and Mrs. Aragorn arrive at the brine shrimp village and are happily greeted by the natives. While unpacking, Avery pulls a Dr. Grant, scaring some poor kid half to death, but she thanks Avery anyway for protecting them from the bad ones. Winta, the daughter of the lady taking care of Avery in the village, runs off with Theo to play. The caretaker asks Avery how long it's been since Avery has taken his helmet off in front of other people, and Avery responds with he was just barely older than the kids playing outside since the last time anyone saw his face. After the caretaker leaves, Avery then immediately takes off his helmet to eat. Avery and Mrs. Aragorn go for a romantic midnight stroll through the woods, identifying the enemies they're facing. It's about 15 to 20 enemies, including an ATST, giving us a nice "I didn't sign up for this" moment from Mrs. Aragorn. Back in the village, Avery and Mrs. Aragorn tell the villagers they need to leave or they'll die. But the villagers reject this. This is where they live, for generations. And they all agree that Avery will train them to fight. We then get a training montage of Avery and Mrs. Aragorn telling the villagers what they need to do, and then seeing them do those exact things. When asked if there's anyone who knows how to fire a gun, only the lady caretaker raises her hand. The plan is for Avery and Mrs. Aragorn to take care of the ATST and draw the Gamorreans out of the forest where the villagers can take care of them. Avery and Mrs. Aragorn sneak into the Gamorrean camp where they draw them out of the forest into the open where the villagers can fight them. They blow up something blue and are chased by the ATST through the forest. However, the ATST fails to take that last step and fall into their trap, and the villagers are attacked. Mrs. Aragorn takes Avery's rifle and rushes out to attack the ATST all by herself, trying to intimidate it into taking that last step. They decide, for some reason, that they need to leave the protection of the barricade and fight the Gamorreans in the open while the ATST is right there shooting at them. After taking about 5 baby steps forward, Mrs. Aragorn finally gets the ATST to take that one last step they needed it to take, and it falls into their trap. Avery turns on an explosive, rushes into the battlefield, and destroys the ATST. With the ATST destroyed, the remaining Gamorreans flee the battlefield as the villagers rejoice. The next morning, Theo is hunting for his breakfast, but is body shamed by the other kids into not eating anything. Mrs. Aragorn and Avery have a discussion about the importance of the Mandalorian helmet and how, once it's been removed in front of people, it can never be put back on. Avery tells Mrs. Aragorn that since they raised hell a few weeks back, word will soon circulate around and he needs to move on before people come looking for him. But that he plans on leaving Theo behind, since Theo loves the village. The The scene cuts to a bounty hunter walking through the forest with a tracking phone. Avery has a conversation with the lady caretaker where she asks him to stay and reaches up to take the helmet off, but Avery stops her. She agrees to look after Theo as one of her own as the bounty hunter sets their sights on Theo's head. Suddenly, the sound of blaster fire is heard piercing the forest, and we see that Mrs. Aragorn was the one who pulled the trigger on the bounty hunter. Mrs. Aragorn and Avery say their farewells to one another, as he informs her they'll be bypassing the town we saw at the beginning of the show, and instead heading straight for the Razor Crest. Wood says farewell to Theo, and the two of them depart. Okay, so let's talk about the bad things in this episode. First of all, they spent a lot of time in the opening shot of this show focusing on all the women in the tribe. At first, I thought this was going to be an all-female tribe, but after a couple random guys were thrown in during the opening attack, it gave me the impression that we were going to get more of an episode like Emancipation from Stargate SG-1. And anything that gives off that vibe is, unfortunately, instantly bad to me. I'm glad they didn't go that way in this episode, but whenever I see a village that is overwhelmingly one gender over the other, it ruins my ability to be immersed in the episode itself. And there were a lot of shots establishing that this is a mostly female village. All the shots of the people working were girls. All the shots of the kids were mostly girls. Most of the people just standing around were girls. It's a village of about 90% women, and the reason it bothered me is because there was no explanation given for this. This isn't a village of Amazonians. The men weren't killed off in a battle at some point earlier in the episode, or before we arrived in the village. It's just, this isn't something that would occur naturally, and we were given no explanation for why it did occur. And so it really, it kept drawing me out of the episode every time they did one of these shots, and it was just either 100% or 90% women. Also, Avery is way too cavalier with Theo in this episode. He tries to get him to wait in the ship in an unfamiliar land and then just leaves him with the bar owner that he just met like half a minute before. Avery knows people are after Theo. So what's with Avery all of a sudden? What's with this I just don't care about your safety attitude when the past 3 episodes we've been seeing him grow more and more concerned about Theo? And even in this episode, we see him growing increasingly concerned about Theo. So just the fact that, I mean, this was just within the first couple minutes, and then it goes on throughout the episode where he just randomly doesn't care about Theo. And so it was this weird, oh, I care about Theo so much, but I don't really at the same time. That was something I really didn't like, just this weird attitude going on. Mrs. Aragorn. For those who didn't watch my spoiler section, that's just the name I gave the lady supporting character in this episode. She gives a very confusing info dump when we first meet her. I couldn't figure out if she was supposed to be a Mandalorian, if she was ex-Imperial. It's just, is this supposed to be a mercenary or just a perfect warrior princess? Darn it. I should have called her Xena. Well, too late. Moving on. I listened to her info dump several times, and I couldn't follow it. It starts in the middle of a sentence, and then they show a bunch of information, just bam, 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 just kind of showcase how cool she is. But it just barely fails us to give enough information, so we're left feeling more confused than awe. In fact, it wasn't until several minutes later that we found out she was a former shock trooper. What this means is that Mrs. Aragorn is in fact a gender-swapped clone of Jango Fett. Or maybe she transitioned after cloning. I don't know. The fact that we have a female shock trooper really raises a lot of questions to me, and I'm not sure if I want them all answered. There's another thing where, when they first meet, Mrs. Aragorn immediately assumes that Avery is part of the Bounty Hunter Guild. But we're given no reason for why she would believe this. I mean, I know ultimately the answer is that it's bad screenwriting, as they wanted a fight to occur between Avery and Mrs. Aragorn just to showcase how cool Mrs. Aragorn actually was. But in universe, there's no reason for her to immediately identify him as a bounty hunter. Like, it would have made more sense for him to be a traveler or a mercenary, since Avery's, head to toe in Mandalorian armor, something that people make an assumption about later on in just a few minutes. Her thinking that he was Bounty Guild and being correct was borderline supernatural, honestly. And then another bad thing, immediately after making a big deal about never taking his helmet off in front of other people, Avery takes his helmet off and sets it down on the windowsill to eat his food. We don't see his face. Instead, it focuses on the helmet sitting on the windowsill there. But why on earth would he do this after making such a point about never taking his helmet off in front of other people where he could be seen? He's inside this one room, one story, thatch hut with kids playing right outside the window. There would have been like 10 or 15 people who saw his face while he was eating. It makes no sense for him to do this. And honestly, it would have made more sense for him to look wistfully out the window as he'd just been talking about, oh, the last time someone saw my face, I was one of these kids. So he would have looked out the window, wistful music would have been playing, then he would have lowered the blind, taken off the helmet, and set it down to eat. And we would have gotten this impression that Avery is isolated. There's a boundary up between him and everyone else in the world, and it would have made such a more fulfilling and well done edited shot. And the fact that we don't do this, and instead he does this moment where anyone could have seen his face, it was just a bad storytelling moment. Another bad thing is that at one point during a fight that happens between the villagers and some other people, they've built up this barricade, and they decide that they're going to leave the protection of the barricade to fight these raiders out in the open. And it makes no sense for this to happen. In fact, they even present it as, it's now or never. And so everyone charges out from behind the barricade to attack on this open field. But why would they do that? I mean, they had the protection of the barricade. They were being shot at. They had some blasters to shoot back. The fact that they would leave this highly defensible area just to be slaughtered out on the plains makes zero sense. And even if your mindset was, well, we got to get close enough for hand-to-hand combat because some of us only have pointy sticks, that's what the barricade is for. As people try to climb over it, you stab them. They're literally climbing. Their hands are too busy to do defensive things with. And so that really drove me out of the moment. I know I can't expect screenwriters to be perfect tacticians, but I should expect in-universe for at least the Mandalorian or Mrs. Aragorn to have better training, and especially Mrs. Aragorn. She was a former shock trooper. She should have told them, no, stay behind the line. But no one says anything. They treat it like this was a good decision. And so that was just a really bad moment to me. After the battle with the villagers, Avery says he needs to leave quickly before word spreads around and people start coming to look for him. But that at the same time, he plans on leaving Avery behind. It's like no one listened to this dialogue out loud before sending it out live. People are going to come no matter what. Why would you leave Theo behind where you won't be around to protect him when those people come? In fact, the very next scene is that of a bounty hunter with a tracking fob in the first, as if it was some big reveal like, oh my goodness, there's a bounty hunter. But it would have been a big reveal if Avery had been thinking, oh wow, this is such a nice village. I should settle down here. Avery loves it. This is a good place to love, or excuse me, Theo loves it. This is a good place to raise Theo. And then all of a sudden we see the bounty hunter and we go, oh no, we know something that Avery doesn't know. That word's gotten out. But the fact that he literally just talked about word getting out, and that even though he knows word is getting out, even though he knows people are looking for Theo, he's still just going to leave Theo there completely undefended. It made no sense. It really makes me kind of be like, who wrote this episode? I mean, we've been having such good writing up to now, and I know that the only person credited is Jon Favreau for some reason, but that's not how these TV shows work. He didn't write every episode. There's going to be a group of people doing different parts, and I want to know who's responsible for not thinking this part of the episode out. They really should have done just a couple scene changes right here with this one bit of dialogue where he's thinking about staying. We cut and see the bounty hunter coming, and then all that stuff happens, and he realizes that no, he can't stay here. And then we would have gotten a more human-looking side of Avery as he's caught between who he needs to be and who he wants to be, but instead we get none of that. And so that was a really bad thing that happened for me in this episode. Okay, those were my bad things. Let's talk about a couple nitpicky things I had in this episode. First of all, at the village Avery is protecting, he's served some food. And the lady bringing it stands at the door and says, knock, knock. And now, let me be honest, this is a stupidly nitpicky thing for me to have. But I have it. This lady is a farmer in the middle of nowhere with no ships around and basically a one horse, one carriage way to get in and out of town to carry their brine shrimp. And there is no way she has been anywhere except her own village where they don't have doors. They have some thatch that they've tied together that can be pulled down or pulled to the side or something to act as a door. There is no way she would know the phrase, knock knock. There's no knock knock noise to be making anywhere in this village. More importantly though, this was a perfect opportunity to throw in a knock knock joke. And they completely missed it. That's my real nitpick. They didn't do the knock knock joke. No, my real nitpick is just that, there's plenty of places in the world that have these kind of huts. And instead of knock knocking, because they can't knock knock on thatch, they do other things like they whistle, they clap, they snap, they click their tongues. There are so many things they could have done to have a more realistic representation of how life in a village like this would have been, and they missed it. And so it was a dumb nitpicky thing on my part, but it's something I still had. One of my other nitpicky things is during a training montage we're given between the Mandalorian Avery and these villagers is we see some people training with pointy sticks and some people training with blaster rifles. And it was nitpicky to me because when we see them handing out these blasters and rifles, there's more than enough for everyone in the village to have one. But for some reason they decide that we need pointy sticks right now more than everyone having a blaster. So pointy sticks, here you go. My final nitpick was there's a scene where Avery and Mrs. Aragorn set off an explosion where there are these open tubs of something blue and, they have a light shining up from the bottom. So it's something glowing in blue. And I looked at it and I'm like, what's the significance of this? Like, I realized that this was supposed to be a significant moment. They were supposed to be blowing up something essential to these raiders, but I was given no context for why this was important. Was this some sort of special food that the raiders needed? Was this fuel for this weapon that the raiders were using to attack the villagers? I don't know. And so it ended up being kind of an underwhelming moment that they blew this stuff up when it should have had some weight behind it. It was a nice explosion though. So, I mean, there's that. Okay, so that's my bad and my nitpicky. Let's talk about the things I just meh about, my neutral stuff. Neutral things. This episode comes off feeling very Seven Samurai inspired, right down to the village being populated by fairly looking Asian and Polynesian type people. And they're working in what could easily be kind of mistaken for rice paddies. Now, The Seven Samurai is one of my favorite classic Japanese movies. It was made way back in 1954. And I enjoy a good remake of it, despite the fact that somehow I've yet to see The Magnificent Seven. And while this episode carried over some general tactics and plots, it did a bit too much to be a kind of a reference and a homage and nod toward The Seven Samurai, but it didn't do enough to be a good remake or a good representation of it. It hit this weird gray meh area for me personally where I didn't like where they landed. I would have liked it more if they had done more or if they had done less in reference to The Seven Samurai. My other nitpick thing, and I only had two, so my other nitpick thing was we get to see a weapon in this episode that we saw back in the original trilogy. And I'm not going to say what it is. You can watch the episode yourself. You'll see it. You'll know what I'm talking about. And they did a real good job of making it look intimidating the way it should have been back in the original trilogy. But I just couldn't find myself being intimidated by this thing since it was such a joke of a weapon in the original trilogy. And I honestly don't know why. In the last episode, I really praised the fact that they made the battle droid look so intimidating. And in this episode, when I saw this weapon being made intimidating, it was a meh thing to me. And I have no idea why one was good and one was meh, but when I saw this weapon being intimidating, and it was just a meh moment for me. Okay, so that was my bad, my nitpickies, and my neutrals. Let's talk about the good things that happened in this episode. One of the best things, in my opinion, that we get to see in this episode is we get to see a small glimpse into who Avery is. And I love these moments where we get to learn more about who Avery is and how he fits into the larger story. Not necessarily about like, this is my entire back history, but more about like just who Avery is inside his own mind. And in this episode, it's somewhat implied that Avery might not be a true Mandalorian, but someone who was adopted into their culture or religion after the death of his parents. And I thought that this could make for a really interesting dynamic to the character of Avery. That Avery wasn't just another Mandalorian, but someone who would be permanently regarded as an outsider no matter how hard they tried. The other thing that I really liked about this episode was I loved the character interaction we got between the lady caretaker and Avery. It's a bit cliche, kind of this will they, won't they love dynamic, but I really did love to get to see Avery as a human character with his conflicting desires between who he wants to be, where he wants to settle down and be a part of this village, somewhere safe, and who he needs to be, who he has to be, someone who needs to be on the run, someone who is caught up in this Mandalorian culture. So I really enjoyed them exploring that aspect of Avery. Another thing I enjoyed, I just thought of, was we get to see one more weapon, one more specialty weapon. So far we have the vaporizing bullets for the rifle, we have the whistling birds, the little needles, and then we have these little explosive round pucks that he presses them and it does a countdown timer and then explodes. So I like that we're getting to see him building up his arsenal, and I'm really hoping that we get to see all this pay off, because each time they show me some new piece of technology to showcase how cool Avery is, the more interested and invested I'm becoming in this final showdown that surely they're going to have, as Avery has to use all these weapons to defend himself. So that's my summary of the good, the bad, the nitpicky, and the neutral stuff. That said, in the end, this was a weaker episode for me. I enjoyed it. It had good action. We got to see more into the mind of Avery, a fact that really saved this episode for me. But as you can see from my review, I made a lot of bad notes for this episode. I felt like too much was subbed into a few minutes of dialogue, and there were just a couple bits of dialogue and scene ordering that came at the wrong moments for this episode to really work well. It just lacked that little polish to make it a great episode. And as a result, I'd only give this a 6 out of 10. It's better than the second episode, and I'm sure I'd enjoy it well enough if I watched through the season again, but it's not going to hit the top of my personal charts for the season. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for joining me on this review of The Mandalorian called The Sanctuary. And until the next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.